Good evening, everyone. My name is Nevena Spirovska, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. On behalf of the Victorian Multicultural Commission, I welcome you to the first Curious Conversation event as part of Cultural Diversity Week 2021. We begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to elders past and present. I extend this respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander joining us tonight. We acknowledge the connections to the lands, skies and waters, as well as the Woiwurrung language, stories and songlines. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this was and always will be Aboriginal land. To begin the evening, I would like to welcome the chairperson of the Victorian Multicultural Commission, Viv Nguyen. She is a passionate advocate for genuine community engagement, and diversity is Viv's greatest strength. She arrived in the country 12 years ago, and for over 25 years, Viv has worked as a business executive, as well as embracing and celebrating our diversity and difference. Thank you very much, Viv. Welcome to the stage.
And a good evening to you. I also like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Victoria. I would also like to pay my respects to Aboriginal people who are attending this event tonight. The Victorian Multicultural Commission is an independent body that connects and advocates people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities to the government. There are many things that we do, but one of the things that we do is put on major events throughout the year to celebrate the cultural diversity of this state and this nation. Many of those events that you have attended, and perhaps without knowing that we are behind these events. One of our flagship events is Cultural Diversity Week, and it is running right now, and we are very excited that this session is part of it. This is the first installment of the Curious Conversation series, which will be running over the coming months. In these discussions, we will be asking speakers and people online, what do we want to see Victoria look like in 2030? Young people will be crucial in shaping our future. So, what better way to start off the Curious Conversation series than to hear directly from them? In Ahmed, Hanisha and Tim, we have three Victorians absolutely committed to proving that the vibrancy of our culture depends on our ability to move beyond tolerating the differences in the cultures to celebrating them. I'm sure it will be a compelling conversation tonight, and I look forward to hearing from them about the future, about the dreams they have, and how we can collectively work together to make them happen. Thank you, Nevena, for hosting tonight's vital Curious Conversation, and thank you to everyone who are here tonight and everyone who are joining us online. We hope you will share with us your own visions of what multicultural Victoria will look like in 2030. And let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viv. Next, we have two socially distanced messages from the Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Ros Spence, as well as the Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Neil Angus.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of the launch of this much cherished event on Victoria's cultural calendar. After the year that was, it's fantastic that Victorians can gather in person again to celebrate our state's cultural diversity, a source of great pride for us all. Victoria is a place where people can find community and connections, share culture and knowledge, and feel a sense of belonging. Cultural Diversity Week is treasured because it shines a spotlight on multiculturalism, one of our state's greatest assets. And I'm sure this evening will be an opportunity for a captivating and insightful conversation about the future of our state's multiculturalism. This is a significant conversation to have as we begin a week that will focus on recognising both how far we have come and the work that we still have ahead of us. The pandemic has certainly highlighted the disproportionate challenges faced by multicultural communities, such as a lack of access to culturally appropriate health advice and resources, as well as discrimination and racial abuse. We must use occasions such as this to address the reality for many multicultural Victorians and work together to create a more equal, just and inclusive society. I'm pleased the Victorian Multicultural Commission has chosen the theme, "What does multicultural Victoria look like in 2030?" for this year's Cultural Diversity Week. This is an opportunity to combine our creativity, skills and knowledge to be empowered and supported to dream big and to ask the difficult questions that help us to map a path towards a brighter future. As Minister for Multicultural Affairs in one of the most diverse societies in the world, I'm confident that we can do more to promote and support multiculturalism in Victoria. We need to boldly envision a future in which all Victorians have equal access to opportunities and are not treated differently because of the circumstances or families they were born into. Almost 1 in 2 Victorians were born overseas or has a parent who was. We are a state comprised of people who come from 200 countries, speak more than 260 languages, and follow more than 130 faiths. But this is not just about numbers. It's about individual stories and experiences behind those numbers. I'm sure that this week's curious conversations will encourage us to seek out those stories, learn the lessons they hold, and use these to build the Victoria that we want to see in 2030. I encourage you to be brave and ambitious with your ideas. We all have a brighter future to gain from it.
Yassas, Mahavan, Ciao, Ni Hao, Namaste, Sat Sri Akala, Sin Ciao, Hello. My name is Neil Angus and I'm the Shadow Minister for Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs for the State Opposition here in Victoria. I'm delighted to send my best wishes to you all as we come together to kick off another inspirational Diversity Week. Diversity Week encapsulates the heart of our multicultural landscape while reconfirming our commitment to social harmony and multiculturalism. All over Victoria, our communities will embrace, celebrate and share in the different cultures, faiths and languages that make up our vibrant society. I take this opportunity to thank all our community organisations and members of our many diverse communities for your immense contribution to our great state. You play an incredibly vital role in delivering outstanding services, fostering and supporting diversity, and promoting community harmony. Cultural diversity underpins everything that makes us who we are as Victorians. Our cultural, linguistic, and religious diversity has long played a distinctive role in the character of life in our state, contributing to the vibrancy of our society and our collective prosperity. Cultural diversity makes us who we are and who we are as Victorians. This heritage contributes to Victoria's identity, livability and attractiveness as a world-class destination for education, tourism and business activities. But as our diversity grows, our approach to community harmony and social cohesion is increasingly essential in realising our multicultural society's full potential in the future. The Curious Conversation lecture series, beginning this month, will discuss what multicultural Victoria looks like now, what it should look like in 2030 and what we need to do to get there. I encourage all Victorians to be part of this discussion and to come together, celebrate and take advantage of the many great activities happening throughout the week. I also encourage each one of you, our richly diverse communities, to continue to share your traditions, culture and stories and pass on your legacy for the benefit of younger generations and the whole of Victoria. Thank you to the Victorian Multicultural Commission for your hard work in putting together another celebration of our diversity. Thank you.
Now it's my pleasure to welcome you to the panel part of our event. Tonight, we'll be hearing a very curious conversation that explores this year's theme. What does multicultural Victoria look like in 2030? This is the first in the series, and we will discuss what multicultural Victoria looks like now, what it would look like in 2030, and what needs to be done for us to get there. We'll be examining it through the lens of 3 young people, understanding their vision and how we make that happen. But we also want to hear from you. If you have a question for our panel or our panelists, please join us through the Facebook conversation. Your voice is important and we really want to hear from you. So what will Victoria's multicultural future look like? Our panelists will help us understand that tonight. I'm joined by Ahmed Hassan, Hanisha Sharma-Luital and Tim Lo Surdo. Ahmed is an influential and respected advocate for Melbourne's multicultural community, dedicating his life to empowering and motivating young people to break the cycle of disadvantage. At 18 years of age, Ahmed became the co-founder and executive director of Youth Activating Youth. He is driven by passion to attain social cohesion and works with government and industry to address the issues faced by disadvantaged youth and to overcome social barriers. Welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you.
Hanisha arrived in Australia from Bhutan in 2003 as a refugee with her family. She currently works in the office of Victorian Senator Kimberley Kitching. Hanisha is the founding chairperson of Help-Himalayan Youth Foundation, an initiative led by Bhutanese, Nepalese and Karen communities. Hanisha has served as a member of the Multicultural Multi-Faith Youth Network of the Victorian Government, Youth Parliament Delegation of YMCA, and as an executive member of the Bhutanese community in Australia. Welcome, Hanisha.
Thank you.
Tim is the founder and national director of Democracy in Colour, Australia's first racial and economic justice organisation led by people of colour. Deeply passionate about people-powered change, Tim has spent the last 8 years creating opportunities for everyday people to take collective action. Before starting Democracy in Colour, Tim helped low-paid workers set up Hospo Voice, a union for hospitality. Previously, Tim was the head of campaigns at Oaktree, a senior advisor to 2 federal senators, the campaign director at Jakarta, the national communications director at UN Youth Australia, and the co-founder of Open Sky. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks.
We are now halfway through Cultural Diversity Week, and culturally, we've seen a massive shift since 2020. First Nations and multicultural communities, movements and advocates have brought their issues of race, social cohesion and community to the forefront of the national conversation. But how will that inform our future? And what does multicultural Victoria look like in 2030? Hanisha, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much, Nevena, for that very warm welcome. First of all, I would like to say good evening to everyone, and I would like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and wherever they might be watching from today. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I am from the Bhutanese community and have been serving as a founding chairperson for Help-Himalayan Youth Foundation, one of the first youth-led organisation established by like-minded refugee youth from Karen Burmese community and the Nepalese community youth. I'm thankful and humbled to be joined here today with my esteemed leaders tonight, and I would like to thank Chairperson Vivian Nguyen and the officials at Victorian Multicultural Commission for this opportunity and bringing together curious conversations focusing on youth while we celebrate 2021 Cultural Diversity Week. I came to Australia as a 7-year-old former refugee from Bhutan, and today I stand here, or sit here today, being able to express my opinion and views on how we can shape the future of multicultural Victoria. For this, I am truly grateful to Australia and its people for embracing me and my family and for providing us with an opportunity to empower opportunities and that have empowered us to achieve what we have today. I'm able to help other people from new and emerging communities with lived experience, many of who've had a similar journey to mine. For me, this year's celebration is much more than Cultural Diversity Week. As we all remember, we've faced one of the most challenging and difficult times in memory and perhaps for our lifetime as we battled COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. As a young person, when I reflect on 2020 during the pandemic, I remember when Help-Himalayan Youth Foundation visited homes and distributed essential food packages, personal care and masks. We spoke to many young people and their families, of whom they expressed their relief and gratitude that they had not been forgotten in a time of crisis, that there were people they recognized and understood from their own communities taking care of them and providing them with support. When I think about what does multicultural Victoria look like in 2030, I like to think about how can we create a society, institutions, and a political system that is inclusive, fair, and just for all. I would like to see a society that is free of racism and discrimination, with equal respect to our Indigenous people, people of colour, and our LGBTQIA communities. I believe that while we celebrate and share tremendous achievements of Victoria, we should keep making bold steps with open and inclusive attitudes, spelling out inequalities that will make our multiculturalism pragmatic, meaningful, and envy of the world. We need a strong paradigm shift by creating a public discourse that multiculturalism is not only sharing cultural food and dance every once in a while, but making it a way of life in Victoria every day. When we make policy, we can begin by engaging many youth and multicultural communities like ours and allowing us to participate when making policy decisions, making us a part of the system and its implementations. In this way, we can create a stronger society that will bring real change. Let us be part of the solution. Thank you, Nevena.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing that. And Ahmed, when you look forward to 2030, what do you see in multicultural Victoria?
Thank you, Nevena. And my name's Ahmed Hassan. I'm 24. Co-founder of Youth Activating Youth, and before I also begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we are on, and I would like to acknowledge their elders, both past and present. Look, it's Cultural Diversity Week, and I hope to be celebrating Cultural Diversity Week every week in 2030. I know that might not sound as realistic, but again, it needs to stop and becoming only a once a week event in a year. We've got 51 other weeks we could celebrate, what makes us, what's our strength, which is diversity. And I don't say that lightly, because we've just come out of the most difficult, 2020, which was one of the most difficult years for a lot of young people and people in general. We've seen a lot of young people, not only young people, but many communities stigmatised, facing racism, unemployment, educational barriers, health and wellbeing. Mental health was through the roof for many migrant communities. And being at the forefront and seeing a lot of these things happen, I think about how some of the services could be improved by 2030, and we've got a lot of work to do in the next 9 or 10 years to really improve that. And that comes to having a just system, having more people, not having people because it's good to have one person representing a business because it reflects a certain number of people in the community. But again, it needs to be stop being tokenistic. I think it needs to be more about, it needs to be built within the frameworks of the business's strategy. It's not a corporate social responsibility. It should be part of the business succession about how a business or a political or politics in general, bureaucracy, how they see themselves growing and becoming more successful should be about implementing diversity at its core, not you know, towards the finishing lines and saying, yeah, we should have a number of young people or a number of diverse people working for our organisation or company. And I think in my work, what I've seen in the last 6 years of youth activating youth is that a large number of young people miss out because of their name, colour, of their skin, because they live in a certain postcode. And what we want to do is stamp that out. In 2030, what we want to see is an equal and just society. It's a society that accepts people for who they are and where they've come from, and respects their struggles, but also, you know, wants them to come on board to contribute further to what their mission is, wherever you're playing a role, whether it be a sporting club, whether it be in schools, whether it be in things. And I think one of the most important things we can do is have a chat, have that understanding, have those conversations. And I think, and I'd like to thank the Victorian Multicultural Commission for taking the lead in organising and facilitating these conversations, because they are vital, and I don't just say that they're vital, but they are extremely vital to many people in the community, because those conversations have not been had for a long time, although it happened virtually. But again, I think we need to have more conversations. We need to accept who we are, accept each other, and, you know, continue working towards those ambitious targets that we set out to be.
Thanks, Ahmed, and such an important point there about conversations leading to actions. I look forward to touching on those. And Tim, when you're in 2030, what does that look like for you in a multicultural Victoria?
It's great to be here, and it's great that we're having this conversation. I think a just multicultural Victoria in 2030 embodies 4 themes. I think the first one is First Nations justice. I think the second one is dignity. The third one is safety. And the fourth one is self-determination. I think because how deeply entwined First Nations justice is, and how inextricable First Nations justice is to racial justice, it's critically important that the 2030 Multicultural Victoria really embodies that. And that looks like tackling rampant Indigenous over-incarceration, the fact that Indigenous people make up about 3% of Australia's population, and yet they comprise 29% of Australia's prison population, the fact that Indigenous women are the fastest growing incarcerated group nationally, the fact that, you know, we incarcerate young people at an extraordinary rate, that some 600 young people, some as young as 10, are locked up every year. It looks like tackling our deaths in custody crisis, that there have been some 430, at least 437 deaths in custody since there was a Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody in 1991, and there have been 0 convictions, 0 accountability, no change really implemented to stem this crisis and address it. I think it looks like addressing the radical difference in life expectancy and standards of living if you're a First Nations person in this country, or if you're non-Indigenous. Like the fact that there's a second stolen generation happening right now, that Indigenous kids are 10 times more likely to be taken into out-of-home care than non-Indigenous kids. That you know, Indigenous folk have a life expectancy that's 10 years less than average. So I think that's the first thing, that to really call itself a just society in general, but especially a just multicultural society, Victoria and the rest of the country in 2030 really needs to reckon with these issues and to make meaningful and systemic action towards those. I think the second thing is dignity. You know, they say that dignity is an essential need of the human spirit, and for so many people of colour in this country, their experience of getting through their day is 1,000 small cuts to their dignity, whether it's everyday racism on the street or in public or at work, or whether it's seeing their communities used as the personal punching bags of some politician or some commentator on national TV, or whether it's seeing policies passed in Parliament that completely disregard their lived reality, or seeing decisions made about them that never involve them in the decision making or construction process. So I think that's the second thing. I think the third thing is safety. For so many people of colour, it's just, and we saw this, with the pandemic and with the rise in racism and in particular anti-Asian racial abuse that we've seen. We've seen this before, especially in Victoria, with the whole hysterics around African Australian gang violence and the whole racialised crime panic that existed then, and the resulting increased attacks on African Australians, that for so many people of colour, it's not a safe experience to just walk out of your house or go down the street or pick up groceries. The Migrant Justice Workers Initiative last year did a report that showed 1 in 4 international students experienced racial abuse. The Asian Australian Alliance did a survey last year that got 500 unique stories of racial abuse within a couple of months of launching. So, this is the reality for so many people of colour in this country, and we can't talk about a multicultural society if you don't even feel safe walking out your front door. And I think the last one is self-determination. There are so many structures and policies that are set up in this country, whether it's, working as a migrant in this country, or your visa status, or just whether you're able to be seen or represented in decision-making spaces, that mean that a lot of people of colour, a lot of migrants in this country aren't able to self-determine their own lives, aren't able to control what happens within their own lives, and that needs to shift as well. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation tonight to explore some of those things.
Thanks, Tim. And I think that's a potent reminder with all of our struggles, there is no justice without First Nations justice in this country. Next, I'd love to explore, and you've touched on them as well, Tim, so I might start with you. What do you see as the main issues that need to be addressed, and what are the biggest changes needed for us to achieve the multicultural Victoria?
I don't want to be a broken record. Look, I think there's, look, I've already said the First Nations justice piece. I think there's a critical, it's just absolutely, we can't talk about racial justice, we can't talk about tackling systemic racism without talking about First Nations justice, without talking about over-incarceration, deaths in custody, without talking about the second stolen generation that's happening right now, the huge variances in living standards between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So that's one thing. I think there's another a big component around worth and how, that I'm really keen to explore around how people of colour, how the worth of people of colour and how the worth of migrants is determined in this country. That for so many people and in our society and in our discourse, migrants are only worthy when they're contributing certain things, when they're contributing to the economy or when they're taking certain jobs that nobody else wants to take, whether that's in farm work or whether that's in, security or cleaning. But migrants, it often feels in this country that migrants and people of colour aren't just seen as worthy because they're human, and I think that really needs to shift when we're talking about multicultural Victoria in 2030. That I think the intrinsic worth, the intrinsic humanity, the intrinsic dignity of people of colour needs to be seen as they are. They don't need to do anything. They don't need to be doing a certain job or have a certain education to be seen as worthy or to be seen as human. And I think that was really embodied last year with the government, the federal government's response to the coronavirus, the fact that some 1.1 million temporary visa holders, international students, people seeking asylum, undocumented workers were not given any form of assistance, whether it be JobSeeker or JobKeeper. We've been having a whole debate recently over whether JobKeeper has been, the amount of welfare support that we provide people, but we've forgotten that there have been literally more than 1 million people who didn't get any support at all during an unprecedented, once in a lifetime global health pandemic. And that's an absolute moral, it's just a moral outrage. It's hard to find the words to describe what that is, because you think about how much this country relies on people of colour when times are good. Our tertiary education sector is propped up by international students, and yet when things go bad, we're happy to wipe our hands of millions of people in this country because we just can't be bothered. We're happy to accept the labour of people of colour doing farm work, picking our fruit and vegetables that we buy at the supermarkets, that we make for dinner. We're happy to take the labour of people of colour who give us cheap meals at our local Vietnamese joint or Chinese joint or wherever. We're happy to go to clean workplaces that have been cleaned by people of colour in those cleaning jobs or in those security jobs. But when push comes to shove, That to me is a huge outrage, and I think it really goes back to the fact that we just don't see, fundamentally, I don't think as a society, we see people of colour having intrinsic worth, and that needs to really shift. Beyond the, the festivals and the food and the dancing and whatever, we've got to see people of colour as humans first, and I think that's a conversation we need to be having.
Thanks so much, Tim. And Ahmed, I'm really interested, Tim has touched on a lot of the policy shifts as well as the cultural shifts that we need to see. I'd love to understand what you see as the main issues that need to be addressed and what are the biggest changes needed.
Absolutely, and I think Tim's articulated some of the points extremely well, and I must say I'll share some of those concerns around people of diverse or from multicultural backgrounds being seen as people who bring different foods or wear different clothes or have different types of hair, and that people get intrigued by that, but not as who they are and who they are as a person. And it is very true, because you look at when unemployment happened in society across the country and across the world, when a lot of people were losing their jobs, and towards the end of mid-year last year or towards the end of the year, there was a lot of opportunities, or there was that talk where who's going to work in our farms, and the conversation straight away turned to, we don't have international students, so why don't those long-term unemployed or young people or communities that have been here and have been on the dole, why don't they take up those jobs? They've been looking for jobs. Why don't they go and spend a number of weeks out there? And again, a number of people spoke to me about that, and I said it may not be the same way. It might not be fair for me to say, why doesn't another person who's been long-term unemployed go out there? It might not be good for them for their health or for the family reasons, or they might have reasons as to why. But again, you should not just be pushing a number of people, because that's more the difficult side of the labour aspect. But again, what we need to look at is, if we're going to have a fair and equal society, and some of the issues that I'd like to raise is about, identity being, at the forefront. A lot of people, struggle with this word identity and really understanding who they are, because they're in, society is evolving, and again, I come here and some of the things that I'm used to, my parents are not used to, because they come from back in Africa where things are done a little bit different. But again, it's about understanding that and keeping what's true to yourself at the end of the day. That's understanding what your cultural values are, but also accepting where the country and the land where you live in, and taking that on board, but making sure that it all works. But you're not, the finger's not pointed at you when you do things a little bit differently, or have different types of clothing, or a hairstyle that's a little bit different. Another thing is I'm very passionate about is education, and the education of a number of young people growing up in this state. It's become very difficult during the pandemic, and what we've seen is delayed responses in providing families with support. I think a lot of young people fell behind. I think a good number of young people lost a year's worth of education. Some have dropped out, and again, even though Victoria is a fantastic state in terms of its cultural diversity, its understanding of multicultural communities and what it brings to the Victorian fabric of it, we were still delayed because we did not understand. A lot of young people came from single, where there's only single parent households. Again, unemployment being young people and multicultural communities being the first people to be knocked off a job in March last year. Again, how do they get back up? What trainings were offered to them? These are some of the issues that we still continue to grapple with, and that there isn't the opportunities that there were before the pandemic, but we're still waiting. And Tim, I think, alluded to that, the fact that JobKeeper is coming to an end. Some people were not eligible for JobKeeper, so that they actually fall into the poverty, phase. And it becomes very distressing, because as a person who's seen this happen live, go to homes, deliver care packages, help people with their bills, help people with, different situations, whether it be through mental health and seeking that, assistance, you don't sleep, or it doesn't get away from your body where you just say, oh, I've done this Monday to Friday, I'm going to close off on Saturday, Sunday. It's not as easy as that. It's if this is a passion, then it's with you night and day, 7 days a week. and your phone doesn't stop ringing. So, yeah, those were some of the issues that I'd like to cover here.
Thank you, Ahmed. And Hanisha, I'd love to get an understanding, building on the conversations that we've had there. What would you like to see change, and what do you see as some of the main issues?
Yep. So I think my colleagues here have pointed out some very important things that I also agree with. And I think the first thing also is acknowledgement. I don't think we will get anywhere without acknowledging the fact that we do need to treat our First Nation people better, and that coloured people and people from multicultural backgrounds are disproportionately affected when it comes to things like the pandemic and employment and education. These are the things that first and foremost we need to acknowledge to be able to move forward. And then after that, I think we need to look at representation, and representation not in the fact that, we need to meet a quota for a job. We need this many multicultural people so our workplace can look good. No, I'm talking about the cultural diversity practices at work. Are they aware? Do they know how to deal with the sensitivities of people from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds? I have heard about so many stories about my friends having microaggression at work because of their background and because of their language or the clothes that they decide to wear. So, we need to make employment and industries, particularly corporate industries, actually. I don't think, it's great doing government work and workplace practices, but also like in the private sectors, I feel like cultural diversity and the sensitivities on how to deal with people from different backgrounds kind of can get neglected at times. So we need to also look into that. And following that up, it's great to have a multicultural minister and Indigenous and Aboriginal minister, and a portfolio, but it would be great to be able to implement policies and practices that breach, compassion and understanding throughout all of the government, like all sectors, not just, multicultural sector or whatever. So it would really I would think that is where we should be having the conversation as well.
Thank you. And Ahmed, something you touched on that I'd love to pick up on is the idea of mutual aid and communities caring for each other. You mentioned that was something that you were doing last year throughout the pandemic and continuing this year. What does the community look like to you?
It's when you look at the work that we did last year and it was 7 days, as I mentioned. Again, it's very difficult, right? You're supporting a lot of families, you're dealing with a lot of people, and the households are normally, anywhere between, 5 people living in their household to up to 11, 12. So it's a large household. But one of the things that actually stood out for me personally was the perseverance, the courage, just how understanding and how the spirit in some of these families what stood out to me is that they didn't just give up, put their hand up and just say it was the last resort. That's when they said, look, we can no longer, we're going to miss some meals, or we can't afford to pay rent and we're going to be evicted, right? And I know there was this whole thing about people can't be evicted, but again, it's not above people not to. Everyone was struggling. But one of the things that I actually seen and the positives that I've found was about how people have bounced back and how quick some of those people were ready, how they enabled themselves, and not so much by different opportunities, but just going out there and looking for opportunities to actually get back in the workforce, looking for training opportunities, looking for opportunities to do small amount of work just to be able to live and do things. So you never underestimate what the community can do for itself without having leaders or individuals or volunteers. Sometimes they can help themselves. They're not always wanting a handout. Sometimes it could be advice or a little bit of guidance. But one of the things that I respect about multicultural communities, and I think all communities, is that their ability to push on in very difficult circumstances.
Great resilience. Tim, I'd like to explore this next question with you. What do you think Victoria is currently doing well in terms of strengthening social cohesion and promoting multiculturalism?
Look, I think the state in particular has been leading the way in a few things. There's one thing that comes to mind is recently, the Victorian government announced a whole range of grants around funding anti-racism, which I think is fantastic. I think there should be more public funding for anti-racism initiatives that are driven and led and developed, co-designed by the community. I think there have been a number of initiatives like that. I think really trying to centre multicultural communities and centre lived experience has been another. And I think, offering platforms like this, where we try and have an honest and clinical assessment of how we're doing right now and where we need to go. And it's clear that there are some parts where we're doing well as a state, as a country, and there are many parts where we're not doing well at all as a state and a country. And it's important that we have these forums and avenues so that we're able to talk about those, and we're able to create action plans around how we're going to address this, so that we're not having this same conversation in 9 years' time when it is 2030, that we're actually we're having a different set of conversations. We're having a conversation about what we did over the last decade to tackle Indigenous over-incarceration, or tackle the fact that communities of colour, in particular First Nations and Black communities, are over-policed, are targeted and harassed by our justice system. To talk about how job opportunities aren't given in a proportionate rate to communities of colour. That's there's economic racism, as well as a whole bunch of other things are going on. That's the sort of conversation I'm really hoping we can have in 2030, and that can only happen is if we're honest about where we're at right now, and part of that is having a conversation about what we're doing well, and we like to have that conversation all the time because that's the comfortable conversation. But what I'm very keen on having is a conversation on what we're not doing well, so that we can bring that out into the light. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say, and the only way we can tackle problems is by talking about them and raising them, and then providing accountability through that I think transparency, and that's what I'm hoping we can do through conversations like this one.
Thank you. Accountability through action. I think that's something that we're all incredibly passionate about here. Hanisha, I'd also like to understand your perspective on what you feel Victoria is doing well of strengthening social cohesion and promoting multiculturalism.
Well, yeah, thank you. I think, again, Ahmed and Tim have made very amazing points about that. I think I would like to also say the translation during COVID-19 has been really great in Victoria. It's been able to reach many people, and I think I don't know how many languages exactly the COVID-19 was translated into, but it definitely got around, and I heard very positive things about that. Also, I think Tim mentioned grants, the community grants that Victoria government has been doing. That's been very encouraging to see also. And also sports and recognising. I mean, I know that we've said, dances and food don't do it, but it's, I think, sometimes appropriate to celebrate truly diversity through food and performance, because it can bring people together. I think that's really good. And I think lastly, holding conversations like this and having events where we can actually discuss what's going on right, what can we improve on, how can we do that, what are we hearing as community leaders and youth leaders about what we're hearing from the outside as well. So it's been good.
And Ahmed, was there anything that you wanted to add that you feel Victoria is doing particularly well in this moment?
There is a number of things that the Victorian government does really well, especially in a very diverse state and society that we live in. I think that we've got people in government and different people in politics who understand, and that's through the political spectrum, who understand some of the diverse communities' struggles and needs, I could say, well enough, because obviously we're very diverse, and if you're not a diverse person, you've got a staffer that's diverse, and you've got bureaucracy that's diverse, and I think we're having very good representation and understanding. I think we have a government, and through the government, I think we have this strong body which is called the VMC, which is providing excellent advocacy and support to multicultural communities and to government. And I think that's very important, because I think the role of the VMC and its commissioners, led through Viv, is doing amazing work, and I saw that on display during the pandemic, and on a number of key issues, whether it be through crisis relief, whether it be through lockdowns, whether it be through, the most difficult times, they were standing there with the community. So I'd really like to shine a light on that. Yeah.
Excellent. And we've got some questions coming through in the chat. But lastly, I'd love to put to the panel tonight, what can the audience do to get involved? And starting with you, Hanisha.
I think anybody with a passion can first and foremost gain knowledge. So, you hear something on Facebook or you see something on the news, get online and, find out more about that. And if there are any organizations like ours or the VMC where, help is needed, I think that's something they can do. Yeah, I can't think of anything else right now, sorry.
Great. And Ahmed, how about yourself?
What the audience can do, I think the audience can play a role in, within their households, within their friends, within their, workplaces. I think conversations that they have about some of, directly or indirectly, some of the stigmas and some of the issues that are happening. And I think through conversation of, talking to different friends and colleagues and family members, you do a lot of good within your society and within your circle. And if everyone were to do that, I think we'll have a society that's, pretty informed and very cohesive.
Great. And Tim, what advice would you give to our audience about getting involved?
On top of what's already been said, I think if you're not a First Nations person or a person of colour, I think it's to be a good ally, to be a good accomplice in the fight for racial justice. And I think that looks like leveraging your privilege, your relative privilege. It looks like making space for impacted communities to lead. There's no such thing as the voiceless, as they say. It's just the deliberately silenced. And our system structurally and systematically silences impacted communities in a variety of ways. And if you're a person that has relative privilege in a variety of different ways, then I think it's on you to work out how you can leverage that privilege to undo that structural silencing, to enable the very real and existing leadership of impacted communities that's happening right now to be heard and to be seen in decision-making spaces. I think it's about seeing how you can utilize your resources, whether that's your financial resources, donating regularly to an organisation that works on some of the issues that we've talked about tonight. Or whether it's utilising your vote, making sure you hold accountable the very many politicians, far too many politicians in this country that weaponise race and weaponise racism and weaponise communities of colour to serve their own political agenda, and to hold them to account and to clearly demonstrate through your vote and through, if they're your local member or even if they're not, going to their office and sending them emails and calling their office. That's not acceptable, and that they'll pay a political price at the ballot box if they continue that kind of behaviour. I think it looks like recognising and doing your own self-education on this. I'm as sure everybody in this panel can tell you, being a person of colour, and in particular if you have intersections as a woman of colour or a queer person of colour, or etc., that can involve a lot of emotional and physical labour, and so it's also on you to do your own education and to self-educate around how has this system been intentionally set up to benefit white people, or to benefit men, or to benefit cis folk, etc. And I think, lastly, it's about recognising that this is a systemic issue, that initiatives around like educating people around racism, around like welfare initiatives, all of these things are great and incredibly important. But at the end of the day, you know, racism is a structural and a systemic issue, and it's an issue of power. You know, racism is not an accident. It's intentionally been constructed over many decades and centuries by our political and economic elite to serve a particular public, you know, policy agenda that serves their interests. And racism is a way that is used to get working people to point the finger of blame at each other instead of the broken rules that screw us all over. And so I think we need to recognise that it is a structural issue, that it can't be solved by individuals, you know, working alone, that it can only be solved as all of us coming together, acting as a community, and really trying to challenge the systems which prop up racism. You know, things like predatory capitalism, how predatory capitalism is inextricably entwined with racism, and how those systems really benefit off each other and rely on each other to coexist. So I think there's a really interesting and important conversation to be had there that I'd love to have as a community as well.
And now we've got some questions coming in from the Facebook Q&A, and if there's anything further you'd like to put to our panellists, please just drop it in the chat. We'll start with this one as it's something that we've touched on in our conversation, and we need to go beyond platitudes. So how do we get mainstream media to come to be inclusive and share lived experience by having cultural diversity in mainstream media? Ahmed, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Well, that's a good question. Trying to get mainstream media on board and to understand some of the struggles and the stories is something that I think we all struggle with in terms of trying to get them on board to understand this. And I think it's many of them not understanding the issues of diverse communities and not understanding the sensitivities and just saying, you know, thinking about the value of how that newspaper sells, or how that, you know, the ratings on the quarterly ratings that come out for the TV networks, where it's, you know, this news organisation was, you know, rated the highest because it gave the best story, but it's, in essence, it's hurting many hundreds and thousands of communities. And I could just go back to 2018 and what a disastrous time was it for the community, where, you know, if you look at your current affairs or your different programs where they were covering, you know, after hour shows and, you know, 6 p.m. news, 4 p.m. news, you know, your talkback radios from 8 o'clock in the morning, everything was stigmatising African Australians as being gang members and young people who I've personally worked with, and you know, seeing their stories, because they couldn't name them because some of them are under the age of 18, and seeing their faces blurred, destroyed some of those young people's lives for not only destroyed their lives, but destroyed their families' lives. And seeing that play out and trying to fight that machine was extremely difficult. It was quite extraordinary, and we did not have the political willingness, the, you know, leadership from influential individuals to push back. It was everyone, you know, saying, oh, it's those people again, it's those people. And I think a number of people fell into that trap. But what you realised is there was a few hundred young people who were struggling with schooling, who were struggling to find a job, who were struggling to fit into society. But then again, mainstream media were not educated. But when you spoke to the higher-ups in those organisations, they always said, oh, I'd love to, now that you're explaining, you sit down and you explain those things, because obviously I know the young person, and when you explain to those people at the end of, whether it be the producer or whether it be the executives in those organisations, it's like an eye-opener. And I think we need to have more discussions along those lines where they actually meet the person that they're writing a story about. It's very important you do that. And I think that's what we need in mainstream media, people who actually see, before you write the story, or before you give your, you know, whether you're a commentator, whether you're a, you know, whoever you are, you're a journalist, you come out to the community that you're going to write about. See if it's appropriate, see the sensitivities in place, see the challenges that you'll be putting them in. And you know, you go through a phase where no one wants to employ members of your own community because they're seen as violent and extremely, you know, you wouldn't want to go near them and have nothing to do with those communities. So it's very difficult, and cultural diversity within mainstream media is really important, and something I've been fighting for a long time now.
Yeah, but it's something the mainstream media needs to be reckoned with, and that you raise that important point about facing accountability within the communities and the knock-on effects that has. Hanisha, we talked about representation, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can get mainstream media to be more inclusive.
Yeah, you know, as my colleague was just speaking, I was just thinking about definitely, you know, is accountability, but representation, I think, is just, everything is sort of intertwined with each other. So if we can make a change in the political system and get politicians to hold media accountable for when they're, you know, inappropriately spinning the story to be more sensationalized and sell more copies or get better ratings, you know, that's one thing. But and then the others is the actual community coming out and saying, we're not okay with this type of speech. This type of speech is harmful for these communities, and us all sort of rallying together to get that message out to the media, you know. I think that's one thing. And the media bureaucracy itself needs to hold more workplace sensitivity training, like I mentioned earlier, and also be open to hiring staff from the multicultural community in whatever role that is, just so that, you know, it can create a natural society rather than something forced, and, you know, where it's built around factual and understanding and sensitivity rather than just sensationalism and rhetoric. So, yeah.
And Tim, you were actively working against the campaign throughout the election and in other times. What changes would you like to see in mainstream media in this country?
Well, I think the example of the racialised crime panic is a good one. I remember at the height of this crime panic, it was in a Murdoch paper. They'd sprayed across their front page, you know, some lurid headline about Victorian gangs, and they used a picture of one of these supposed gangs, and the picture was actually like a rap group from the UK, and so it's just stuff like that. And the fact that, you know, the Australian Bureau of Statistics or the Victorian Crime Statistics Agency showed that crime was actually trending downwards in Victoria over the last 10 years. And the fact that, like, all of the statistics and the facts, just like with the climate change debate, you know, all of the statistics and the facts just don't line up with their agenda, but they don't care, because these folks, particularly in the Murdoch media, they're not journalists, they're propagandists, and they have a particular line that they want to push that suits their political interests and their economic interests, and they're going to do that, facts be damned. And so I think, you know, when breakfast TV puts on people like Pauline Hanson, or insert your, you know, your fear merchant. It's all about, you know, eyeballs, and the fact that, like, racism and race and racial hatred brings people to the table, and you know, people like the producers of these TV shows, for example, you know that Pauline Hanson, as an example, is going to say something outrageous, is going to say something despicable, and probably know that that despicable thing is going to have very real implications for the communities that she's talking about. But they don't care, because they also know that's going to create a controversy that's going to be shared 1,000 times on social media, that's going to bring in lots of eyeballs, and that's going to be great for advertising revenue. So I think we need to have a real reckoning, like, you know, talking about systems here, we need to have a real reckoning with how the media uses and exploits particularly communities of colour to generate controversy and to generate advertising revenue. And we need to break up the Murdoch empire. We need to break up News Limited. You know, media ownership in this country is absolutely appalling. The Murdoch News Limited is a blight on this country. It is a cancer on our democracy. And I think you could trace them, you know, you could trace News Limited back to the source, or one of the primary sources, of almost every controversy around people of colour in this country, going back a decade at least, decades probably. And particularly, you know, I just think what the Herald Sun and other papers, what they have done and what they have answered to, which they haven't, nobody's held them accountable for what they did during the racialised crime panic, that they played a huge part, along with the Victorian Liberals, played a huge part in propagating, was absolutely despicable, and has literally destroyed lives, as we've been talking about, has destroyed communities, and they don't care, because nobody's held them accountable. And they knew they wouldn't be held accountable. So we obviously need to change that.
And Tim, staying with that, we've got a question from our Facebook page saying, I understand that there are layers of these systemic issues, policy, media, resources and attitudes. Which one do you think needs to be addressed ASAP and how?
Is that for me? Can you say that question again?
Certainly. I understand that there are layers of these systemic issues, i.e. policy, resources and attitudes. Which one do you think needs to be addressed ASAP and how?
Look, you know, I've got there are smarter minds than me that are working on this. Look, I think it's really hard to know which one to address first because they all seem, as we've talked about earlier, they all seemed intertwined. I think there is a thing around narrative and around how, you know, I feel like nothing precedes purpose, and so like how we view people, like how our society, how our narrative views people, I think is really important because everything sort of flows from there and policy flows from there. And I think it goes back to something we were talking about earlier around how society and how our dominant hegemonic systems view people of colour and whether they actually view people of colour as human at all. And I think last year was a good example of that because you don't like refuse critical life-saving financial aid to people during a once-in-a-lifetime global pandemic if you thought they were human. You know, you just don't do that. It's just not something you do. Unless you just thought they were an ATM or just bodies to pick fruit or just like people to, you know, make your food or like clean your dishes or something, you know, which is apparently what our government thinks that people of colour are and what some of our institutions think people of colour are. So I think the narrative around how we actually view people of colour and how we see people of colour as having worth, that they have to have a certain education, they have to be working in a certain job, they have to be, you know, this model minority myth, I think that needs to shift, and potentially if that shifts, that can catalyse policy changes elsewhere. But this is also like, you know, it's very hard to create that sort of level of cultural change. It takes a long time, so there are no easy answers here. But I think that's definitely something that needs to be worked on, that I don't think there's been a lot of conversation around, and I don't think we have paid as much attention to that as well because it's so endemic and it's so corrosive and it's just so invisible. It's very hard to talk about, and that's, you know, one of the good things, one of the things that make some elements of white supremacy powerful are its invisible parts. You know, it's very hard to take action on something you can't even talk about or you can't put your finger to, and that's, you know, what a lot of people talk about, the dangerous parts of systemic racism, where when you experience it, it leaves you feeling like, did I actually experience that? Is that just in my head? It's the same thing that we're talking about here. Is this narrative actually real, or am I just imagining it? Does this person, or does this government actually think, you know, I'm just a slab of meat, or is this just in my head? You know, it's very hard to point your finger at that, and that's what makes it so dangerous.
Hanisha, with your experience in community work, this person would like to know, how are we ensuring that young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds can find stable connections and opportunities in their community?
That's actually something that has, you know, come to my mind having this discussion. I mean, youth organisation like Youth Activating Youth, Help-Himalayan Youth Foundation and yours, you know, we try to reach out and support as many youth as we can. And I can see that Victorian government has, you know, also tried to do this, but we are in this arena and we're like, you know, sort of dealing with it every day. We can't see how much we've reached or how little to see. So, I mean, I would like to throw this, you know, question around, but so it's how can they get involved, or how can it, what was it?
Meaningful connection with their communities.
Connection with them. How can the Victorian government or just the society? What
how can young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds find meaningful connections in their communities?
How can they? Well, you know, they can get involved in their community because, like we said, everybody sort of like has one. They can try to reach out to the VMC or things. There's different organizations that can help, but if we're just talking about the refugee youth themselves, I would say, you know, try to be brave, because I know from my experience it's very hard to sort of just throw yourself out there in a country that you don't know, the language you don't understand. So I would just say be courageous, try to find something or somebody that you know that can help you through it. And if you want to full dive in, then definitely look for opportunities maybe in the government or like your local community as well, whether it's like moorland or youth. There's always something. So if you are a refugee youth, I would just say have a look, be courageous, and just try to raise your voice, because that's all you can really do. Yeah.
And Ahmed, we touched on before the important conversations that we need to be having with our peers in our workplaces and in education settings. One person has asked, how do you educate your peers who may not understand the lived experience of migrants or second-generation Australians?
Oh, how do you educate a peer who does not understand? And I think it's about, I think you've got to do it in different, stages, and it's got to be a phased approach. You're not going to convince an individual of a circumstance or a lived experience over a 1 hour conversation. I think it has to happen in a number of ways, and I think it's through, one's through conversation, the next one can be through sporting. It's got to be broken down into different phases, and they have to see this in action, whether it be meeting your family, whether it be meeting a group of friends that are like you who also have come from similar lived experience, who've had similar lived experience as you, and trying to also, see what kind of connections, and I think what makes a person, gravitate towards you or even have an understanding towards you is that if they've had a similar, whether it be difficulty or, if you struggle with, you've got to have something in common that you would have struggled with, or someone in your family would have struggled with, and then not even struggled with, or something that they're good at and you're good at. It could be a positive or negative, but at the same time, they have to come towards something. You know what I mean? I remember a person who said that, and this is a person who's quite successful right now, and him not having shoes, and another person of refugee not having shoes, but they've both, one was living in Australia, one's come to Australia, but that's what's made them understand. But one's obviously exceeded expectation because he's been here for a long, he was born here and maybe came from a poverty, family that was struggling with poverty, and he couldn't afford those things. But again, that's the kind of connection that you find. But I think if you break it down, if you kind of find that common approach, then I think you break down a lot of the stigmas. Yeah.
And what are the conversations that you're having and hearing from young people at the moment, especially when they're talking about, say, a migrant experience that they're having with people who might not have connected with it?
The experiences of young people differ, right? So there's a lot of young people are experiencing indirect racism. So it's sometimes it's in your face, but then there's a lot of that young people, and a lot of young people are, you could talk about policing and young people and them facing, getting a large, and this is what we dealt with COVID, a lot of them getting a lot of fines during the COVID restrictions on stage 4 and stay at home, and that issue grows from one thing to another. So, indirect racism because a young person's out, but, not knowing that a young person could have a job and have, be working after 9 o'clock to get to his job to actually contribute. Not all of them are unemployed. So there are a lot of issues that we're seeing on the ground, which are not really, a lot of people are not understanding. So again, indirect racism and racism still exists, whether it be in every workplace, whether it be at a sporting club, within schools, within workplaces. And I think to stamp that out, we need courage, and we need conversations.
Thank you. And Tim, our employers have responsibilities to us. They have a responsibility to make sure that our workplaces are safe. They have a responsibility to make sure that our colleagues treat us with respect. What can employers do to support young people from multicultural backgrounds? What can they do more of?
Well, I think there are a number of things they can do. I think one, they can pay for training on white supremacy and anti-racism for all of their non-people of colour staff to ensure that there is at least a basic level of literacy around anti-racism and around white supremacy and how that can manifest in places like the workplace. I think there are things like, you know, creating autonomous spaces for people of colour staff within that workplace to be able to, like a people of colour caucus or something along those lines, for people of colour staff to go together and to be in a safe space where they can discuss shared experiences of what it's like to be a person of colour in that workplace. I think there is a whole bunch of things around ensuring that, you know, thinking about where does power and where do decision-making roles exist in that organisation, and where diversity exists in organisations, if it exists at all, is usually in junior levels, or it's in certain teams, you know, operations or finance or HR. And so making sure that your company doesn't replicate those things, that you've got people of colour in a variety of different teams, that you, and more importantly, you've got people of colour in a variety of different levels of seniority, that you've got people of colour in your C-suite, in your executive level, on your board, people of colour who have power in your organisation, who aren't just, as we've sort of been talking about earlier, you're not just the token person or on your little pamphlet to you know, wave around, but they're in positions of power and they are in decision-making roles. And this is not just, you know, a value statement. It's not just about, I think, one, it is a value statement. Like, this is a powerful opportunity to embody the tomorrow we're fighting for and how your organisation operates today. But I think it's also just a better way of working. It doesn't matter what you really do. It's going to make your product or your organisation more impactful, and it's going to make it more successful because it's just logical. It means you're going to be able to genuinely engage new communities. And as we were talking about earlier, almost 1 in 2 Victorians from a multicultural background. And this is a huge segment of the market. If you're a for-profit company and if you're a not-for-profit organisation, you can bet that your issue disproportionately impacts communities of colour at the very least, and that it's really important that the people that your issue disproportionately impacts are involved in the creation of the solutions that your organisation is putting forward. So I think there's some, you know, things around training, around creating safe spaces, around ensuring that people of colour are in levels of seniority and actually have power and decision-making spaces. It's not just tokenism. I think there's things around ensuring that there's accountability and there are safe spaces to report grievances is an important process. And I think there's an important thing around, like, why have you asked this question? I'm assuming this was an audience asked question. Why have you asked this question in the first place? You know, like we said, you know, nothing precedes purpose. And if you're asking this question because this is the socially acceptable thing to do, or you feel like you're socially obligated to do so, or, you know, you want to validate an identity of yourself being progressive or whatever, that's probably the wrong reason, because that's just going to lead you to do cosmetic actions that might look good, but are very surface level. But if you're doing this because you genuinely believe it's the right thing to do, this is how we build a more just society, this is how we embody the tomorrow we're fighting for and we believe is necessary in my company or in my organisation, and if because you believe that actually this is how we achieve my organisation's vision and mission and we can't do it without doing these things, then that's going to lead you to do the sort of meaningful and structural action, the serious action, the stuff that actually requires a budget, that requires staff, you know, that requires resources to put behind. That's going to lead you to do those sorts of actions, and that's what you need to take.
Thank you very much. And as our curious conversation winds up tonight, I would just like to thank all of our panellists for joining us, and perhaps just get one final thought to lead us from conversation into action. Ahmed, is there anything you'd like to leave us with?
Have those conversations.
Thank
Quite
you.
simply.
Thank you very much. Hanisha?
Yep. Get out there, be brave, speak up for what you believe in, and you know, don't be afraid to say something when you see something, basically, in the workplace.
Thank you very much. And Tim?
Look, I think I think our ultimate goal here, I mean, I think you can get lost in the policy proposals and in the complexity of these discussions, but really, like, our ultimate goal here as advocates around multiculturalism and racial justice is to build a society and build a country that recognises the inherent and intrinsic worth and dignity and humanity of all people. That's really all we're asking for, to be treated as humans. And whether you're talking about, you know, sexism or the patriarchy or ableism or homophobia or transphobia or racism or anything else, classism, I think at the essence of all of these struggles is just an intrinsic, like, desire to have your intrinsic humanity and your worth as a human be recognised and be seen and to be honoured. And so you can have complex policy debates all you want, but I think sometimes that can be lost in those debates. And just to remember, like, that's the basic demand, really, is to be treated as a human and to be able to, like, have the opportunity, the equal opportunity to realise our own limitless potential and to not have to jump over a million different hurdles to do that. So just to recognise that and to push that message to your friends and family who might not appreciate that.
Panellists, thank you very much. Audience at home, thank you for joining us for this very curious conversation. I hope you take these words into action. Thank you and good night.